Quentin Tarantino's Star Trek IV is just like his unmade James Bond movie. Quentin Tarantino's abandoned plan to direct a James Bond movie resembles the Star Trek IV idea he also walked away from. The Academy Award-winning writer and director is a genre film aficionado who grew up loving James Bond and Star Trek, two properties that launched as movies and a TV series, respectively, in the 1960s. It's no surprise that Tarantino tried his hand at developing both a Bond movie and a Star Trek movie, although neither came to fruition. Quentin Tarantino's Casino Royale idea was echoed over a decade later, when the director mounted his version of Star Trek IV. Tarantino's Casino Royale, set in the 1960s, sounds similar to his plan for Star Trek IV to be a remake of A Piece of the Action, an episode of Star Trek, the original series that originally aired in 1968. Tarantino's concepts for James Bond and Star Trek are both throwbacks to the 60s. However, Tarantino wanted to film his Casino Royale in black and white, while Quentin's gangster Star Trek IV movie would presumably have been in color. Quentin Tarantino came of age loving genre movies and TV shows from the 1960s and 1970s, as evidenced by his nostalgic 2019 hit, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Quentin's preferred Star Trek is Captain Kirk, William Shatner, and Mr. Spock's, Leonard Nimoy, set aboard the Starship Enterprise. However, Tarantino loved J.J. Abrams' Star Trek 2009 and felt Chris Pine perfectly embodied Shatner as Captain Kirk. Similarly, Tarantino was enamored with Pierce Brosnan's 007, believing him to be the best James Bond. Quentin Tarantino's James Bond movie didn't happen for a few reasons. Eon Productions rejected Tarantino's Casino Royale because the director exercises creative control and final cut over all of his films, and Bond's producers didn't want to cede that much power to Tarantino. Another issue was Tarantino wanting to set Casino Royale in the 1960s. James Bond movies utilize product placement, and sponsors like BMW and Omega wouldn't work in a period setting. Ultimately, Casino Royale turned out to be a full reboot of James Bond, although Tarantino was reportedly upset by the film's prologue being shot in black and white. Quentin Tarantino's Star Trek IV didn't move out of the developmental phase for similar reasons. Paramount Pictures and Tarantino didn't see eye to eye on his idea to remake a 1960s gangster episode with Chris Pine's Star Trek movie cast. Further, Tarantino couldn't reconcile Star Trek as his 10th and final film, as Quentin always promised he would only direct 10 movies. A Quentin Tarantino-style James Bond movie and Star Trek IV would no doubt have been entertaining, and both projects are intriguing. What if? Scenarios that audiences will sadly never see. Quentin Tarantino's career has been one of explosive originality and wild experimentation, blending genre conventions with his signature flair for dialogue, violence, and unconventional storytelling. Over the years, his name has become synonymous with gritty crime dramas, grindhouse homage, and movies that often feel like a mad scientist's creation of cinema. Yet, among the tantalizing ideas that have surfaced in interviews and Hollywood gossip, two projects stand out for their sheer potential and ultimately their unrealized form: Tarantino's version of Star Trek IV and his intriguing concept for a James Bond movie. Both projects, though wildly different on the surface, one being a vision of space exploration and diplomacy, the other a long-running spy franchise, bear more similarities than initially meets the eye. The Tarantino aesthetic. Tarantino is known for taking established genres and conventions and flipping them on their head, injecting them with his unique blend of dark humor, meta-references, and sudden outbursts of violence. Whether he's working with gangsters, martial arts assassins, or bounty hunters, his films all share a distinct voice. Star Trek and James Bond, while iconic in their own rights, also adhere to long-standing formulas. Trek is known for its philosophical exploration of morality, science, and diplomacy in space, while Bond movies are structured around espionage, action set pieces, and suave British charm. In both his proposed Star Trek IV and his abandoned James Bond film, Tarantino intended to subvert and play with the established rules of these universes, much like he did with historical fiction in Inglourious Basterds and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's this desire to take beloved franchises and reinterpret them through a grindhouse lens that makes these two projects intriguingly similar. The untold James Bond film. Tarantino's flirtation with the James Bond franchise was rooted in his desire to make a retro Bond movie, one that went back to the source material and stayed true to Ian Fleming's darker, more psychologically complex novels. Specifically, he wanted to adapt Casino Royale before Martin Campbell's 2006 version, which launched Daniel Craig's tenure as 007. Tarantino's idea was to set the film in the 1960s, embracing the Cold War paranoia and the unpolished, morally ambiguous Bond of the novels, rather than the increasingly sanitized, action-heavy portrayal of the late 90s and early 2000s. Tarantino's vision for Bond would have seen a more violent, grittier, and perhaps even nihilistic interpretation of the character, a Bond whose world is messy and whose decisions are morally questionable, fitting seamlessly with the filmmaker's penchant for anti-heroes. Tarantino described how he wanted Bond to be closer to the character in Fleming's books, a brooding figure, one who is often emotionally damaged and caught in a morally ambiguous landscape. This would align with the complex, flawed characters Tarantino has so expertly brought to life in his previous films. However, despite his enthusiasm for the project, Tarantino never got the rights, and Eon Productions went in a different direction with the reboot of Bond. His vision of a retro, more brutal 007 remained an idea, one that was ultimately overshadowed by the sleek, parkour-chasing Bond we got in the Daniel Craig era. Star Trek IV, an R-rated take on the final frontier. Meanwhile, in the world of Star Trek, Tarantino's involvement came as a shock to many. Star Trek had always been the brainier, more diplomatic counterpart to franchises like Star Wars, but Tarantino had a very different view. He envisioned a more violent, adult-oriented Star Trek, one that would lean into the edgier aspects of human nature. It was rumored that his script would have involved gangsters, time travel, and a dose of Pulp Fiction-esque storytelling that would turn the Enterprise's mission upside down. In interviews, Tarantino has hinted at his take on Star Trek being inspired by one of the original series episodes, particularly the 1967 episode, A Piece of the Action, where the crew of the Enterprise encounters a planet whose culture is based on 1920s Chicago mobsters. This perfectly aligns with Tarantino's love for period settings and his ability to turn seemingly small historical or cultural details into major plot points. He could have taken the episode's concept and pushed it to its logical extreme, blending genres in the way only he can, gangster films meeting space exploration in a head-on collision of style and substance. Tarantino's Star Trek was never meant to be the cerebral, philosophy-driven science fiction that defined Gene Roddenberry's original vision. Instead, it was expected to embrace the grit, dark humor, and chaos of humanity that is often suppressed in the franchise's more hopeful vision of the future. This is where the similarities with his Bond idea become clear. In both cases, Tarantino sought to deconstruct the polished veneers of these franchises and explore the raw, gritty underbelly. Much like his Bond idea, Tarantino's Star Trek would have turned familiar characters into something much more dangerous, chaotic, and morally ambiguous. A missed opportunity or a perfect myth? Although neither Tarantino's Star Trek IV nor his James Bond film came to fruition, both projects sparked widespread curiosity, and for good reason. They represent an intersection of high-concept genre filmmaking and Tarantino's audacious, subversive style. In both cases, Tarantino wanted to disrupt the formula, whether that was the suave, indestructible Bond or the idealistic crew of the Enterprise, and introduce a harsher, more unpredictable reality. It's fascinating to think about what these films could have been, not just as Tarantino works, but as reinterpretations of beloved franchises. Would audiences have accepted an R-rated, violent Star Trek or a Bond movie that